Hello everybody, SlimKirby here, and I'm going on a long journey of trying to complete every single Game Boy Advance game in North America. This is the story of the highs, the lows, and all the silly stuff in between for the Game Boy Advance completion experience. This is GB Ace. Hey guys, before we get started, and yes, I am aware this is a very long video, but this is very important, so please listen to this warning. I just wanted to warn people that before watching this, that there are a number of games in this collection that have really weird, awkward, and sometimes just really bad color flashing, and as a result, if your eyes are prone to, epileptic seizures, or just they're really sensitive to stuff like that, just be very careful when watching this. I did my best to try to censor out all of those instances, but keep in mind it's hard to judge this completely because my eyes clearly don't have to deal with stuff like that, so I'm not really the best judge of what's, bad or really bad or anything of that nature. So I just did my best to censor as much as I could, but that is something I wanted to very quickly let you know before we got started. Thank you for listening. Let's get this going. Game number 11, Activision Anthology. Right after finishing Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories, I was prepared for something a bit shorter and faster to complete. Clearly, Activision wasn't paying attention to this request, because they decided to throw 56 different Activision Atari games at me to play through in just one GBA cartridge. And I'm not joking either. Look at the box art. 55 plus games in one. I said this back in episode 1 of this series, and I'll say it again. What have I gotten myself into? Anyway, this version of Activision Anthology was developed by Aspyr and published by, well, Activision. Go figure. So you're probably wondering about the big elephant in the room. What the hell will be the completion goal for this game? It's 56 different games. Do I have to complete all of them? What if a game technically can't be completed? How will I decide when a game is done? Well, truth be told, it's going to be a case-by-case basis for this one. I know that's a rather vague answer, but I'm going to be real here. There are 56 games on this collection, and these are technically not even Game Boy Advance games. They're Atari games ported to a Game Boy Advance cartridge. If this was the Atari completion experience, then sure, but it's not, so let's not split too many hairs with this. I am going to be playing, or attempting to play, all 56 games on this cartridge. What I consider to be the completion requirement will vary from game to game. Some games are high-score arcade-like games, some are sports games. I think I also noticed some board and card games as well. There's actually a lot of variety here. For some games, the goal will be reaching a certain score or level threshold, and others will simply just be completing a round or game of the title in question. I honestly feel like this is the most sensible and reasonable way to do this game for this challenge. And believe it or not, the game does kind of have a setup or model we can use to determine some of the game's goals. You see, back in the old days when Activision made games for the Atari system, they actually offered a pretty neat transaction you could take advantage of. If you beat a certain high score threshold or reached a certain milestone in their games, and if you mailed Activision proof of your completed feat, they would actually send you a custom-made badge or patch as a trophy or medal of some sort to show that you accomplished an awesome feat in one of their games. Now, the cool thing about Activision Anthology is that the game is actually programmed to keep track of whether or not you would have earned that patch in question, basically with a pop-up message letting you know that you met that threshold, and actually adding a checkmark next to the game in question if you did. This is a really cool way to keep track of this information, and does actually give you something to aim for when playing through these games, assuming you actually want to do that anyway. So realistically, would getting all these patches serve as my goal completion for this game? Well, yes and no. For one, not every game has a patch associated with it, and two, I imagine some of these goals would probably be pretty difficult. After all, I'm sure some of the thresholds would imply that you need to actually master the game in question in order to get a free goodie from the devs themselves, right? I feel like that would be a safe assumption anyway. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give each patch an honest attempt. If I get a patch, cool. But if I don't, and it seems like it's a bit out of my reach, I'm not going to push myself to get all of them. At the core, I think as long as we get to experience all of the games in some way, that's pretty much what the developers intended in the first place with this compilation. And any goal beyond that would be 100% territory, not necessarily completion territory. So I hope that all makes sense and is a sensible goal for this challenge. Now, I'm obviously not going to get into every single aspect or intricacy of every single game here, and some of my descriptions will be kind of rapid fire when necessary, but I'll try to say a little bit about each game. As for the general presentation of the game, it's all Atari games, so obviously they show up fine on the Game Boy Advance system. I do kind of like the general setup of the game's menu though. It's like you're in a living room with an Atari console in front of you, and you even have a spindle of every game in the collection that you rotate around to select your game. It's a really neat touch, honestly, and I imagine that's how this looked for my dad in his older days. He didn't have an Atari, but he did have an Intellivision at one point, so I feel the setup was at least kind of similar. Also, the game plays some really groovy music in the background on the main menu, which was definitely a highlight for many of my viewers out there, the fan favorite being Overtaken by Alexander Brown. Take a listen to it, and some of the music in this game if you get a chance. But yeah, let's get into the games. Brace yourself, we have a lot to cover. Number 1, Barnstorming. A very basic game that kind of reminded me of Flappy Bird, honestly. You just fly a biplane over power lines and through a certain number of open barns, trying to avoid crashing into the power lines and the various birds flying in the sky, as they all slow you down tremendously. This is basically a high score game in terms of time trialing, so your goal is to see how fast you can complete each course. There are 4 different layouts for this game, each of the first 3 having a consistent layout that never changes, and the 4th one being completely random. And you can also set 2 different difficulties that can adjust bird formations, as well as the leniency in terms of flying through the barns. To get the patch for this game, you essentially just have to beat a target time for any of the first 3 game modes. I chose the first mode because it was the shortest and therefore the least you had to optimize. It was kinda hard, not gonna lie, but after being persistent and memorizing the best flight paths and patterns, I eventually got it and my very first patch for this game. Hey, at least I got one of them, right? Also, I had a pretty funny moment early on when I first started playing this game. I think from this moment on, I knew this was going to be quite the adventure. Number 2, Baseball. A very simple and basic baseball game. Pretty easy to pick up and play, but very primitive with its controls. Can be kind of a chore to move the right player you want to move when doing the fielding, and the game itself does run incredibly slow too. However, I did manage to get some home runs pretty easily when playing this, so that was actually kind of cool. My biggest problem though was accidentally hitting the select button. You see, the developers for this game, and by this game I mean Activision Anthology, got the incredibly bright idea, and that's sarcasm by the way, to make the select button reset the game completely. Probably because the Atari controller had the same quirk as well. So if you aren't paying attention, it's fairly easy to hit that button by accident, forcing the game to start over completely from scratch. I did this twice when I was already in the 3rd inning in my runs, and after that I just decided to move on. After all, there's no patch for this game anyway, so why bother, right? I eventually went back to the game later at the end of the playthrough and just used save states at the start of every inning, just so I wouldn't have to redo an entire game over again. But damn, talk about a feature that just shouldn't have been a thing in the first place. I get old console authenticity, but come on, that's personally a bit too much, don't you think? Anyway, I didn't try to win this game because the AI is just way too good, and can seriously just get a home run whenever they want or feel like it. They seriously got like 10 home runs in my completed game, and although I did manage a score of 11, there was no way I was beating their score of 21. However, since they opted to cheat with the home run ability, I decided to do some cheating of my own. So here's the true final score of the game. That's right, I won the game 3,927 to 19. I subtracted 2 points from their score because their star player was caught using performance-enhancing drugs, and that is not cool. Anyway, overall, this game isn't too bad. I just wish they would have used a different button for the game reset feature. That still really annoyed me. Number 3, Beam Rider. This game reminds me of Space Invaders, but instead of free-range movement, the movement here is more based around changing lanes. You have to shoot all the white ships to complete a level, and then survive an onslaught from the enemy mothership before moving on to the next one. The patch for this game actually requires 2 different things: a score of 40,000 points, and at least making it to stage 14. Fun fact, the requirements were actually higher in real time, but it seems like they lowered them specifically for the GBA release, which I do kind of appreciate, although I wish they would have done that for another game I'll talk about later. My first attempt at this didn't go too well, but go figure, it was my first time playing this. The second time, though, went much better, and I actually made it pretty far without losing a life. In fact, I actually gained up to 9 lives at one point, and you start with 3, so I was making some good progress here, and had a lot of safeties in my possession. Also, if you manage to destroy the mothership at the end of the level with your missile bombs, you actually get some bonus points based on how many lives you currently have. And with 9 lives in my possession, I was getting points like crazy. Once I hit 40,000, I was shocked by the pop-up message letting me know that I already earned the patch, and that was pretty cool and relieving. I continued my run to the end and actually managed to get up to stage 20, which would have been the original level requirement if we were playing the OG version. Was very short on the 60,000 points I needed for the score though. They really expected you to get those bonus point multipliers, I guess. Number 4, Bloody Human Freeway. Well, that's a game title. This game was pretty much Frogger, but without any sort of penalty for dying. Literally, you can just get right back up again and continue your trip across the freeway. There are 8 different courses to play on, and I did play all of them, but there wasn't a badge for this, or really even a score threshold associated with it either, so it went by pretty quickly. I later found out that this was actually a prototype game for Freeway, a game we'll be playing later, so that explains why there wasn't a patch for this, or really any sort of challenge whatsoever. Number 5, Boxing. Really the first thing people would probably think of if they were asked to describe what an old Atari boxing game would look like. It's very simplistic and just a matter of moving up to your opponent and trying to get as many punches in as you can. You get points by how many punches you land, and if you get 100, you automatically win by knockout. I tried to win in this fashion against the CPU, but they were just not going down fast enough. Still got marked as the winner though by having more points by the end of the round, and once again, there's no badge here, so I'll consider this complete, since I did technically win the fight. Number 6, Bridge. Oh boy, I spent a lot of time on this one, and I wish I could say I completed a full game, but it seemed like whenever we finished a round, the game would just reset back to the start, and I couldn't really understand why. Basically, it's a card game where you and your partner, which you do control both by the way, try to take as many hands as possible by playing the highest card in each trick, and you must play the same suit as the leading player as well, unless you have no more cards of that suit. You can also set a trump suit for each round, which basically acts as a de facto, if you play this, it will take priority over any other card, even the current hand's trick. It honestly wasn't that bad of a bridge simulator, all things considered, but the fact that it felt broken was a bit of a shame. My resolve for this was just to try and take as many hands as I could in one round, while also putting my score displayed in the top left into the positive numbers, since in every game I seem to start at -7 for some reason. And sure enough, even when my numbers were positive, I started the next round with no betting, and sure enough I was still back at -7 again. So no idea why it wasn't working. Not to mention, the CPU felt really hard to beat here too, almost like they knew my cards or something. Also, if it wasn't obvious, there was no patch for this game either, so I was more than tempted to stop after getting my positive round, which I did, and therefore I was done with bridge. Number 7, checkers. I felt really confident going into this one, because whenever I play Mario's game gallery, Mario is always at my mercy whenever we play checkers. However, this AI was admittedly a lot better than what Mario is. The CPU was reading my moves a few steps ahead several times, even going as far as to trick me into jumping them, and luring me into scenarios where they'd turn a loss of theirs into a double loss of mine. Eventually I had a pretty good round though, where I was at least matching them throughout the entire game, and got us both down to our last piece, where I eventually tricked him into a scenario where he had to move into one of my jumps. It felt good beating another AI, although once again, there wasn't a patch for this game, so it ultimately didn't matter too much. I did find it funny though that whenever it was the CPU's turn, the game screen turned black as a way to simulate the computer's thinking for their moves. It actually got me worried that the game crashed a few times too. Number 8, Chopper Command. Finally, another game with a patch, and this one was actually the easiest to get so far. Basically, for this game, you control a helicopter that's trying to shoot down a bunch of enemy aircrafts that are trying to blow up waves of allied trucks. After you destroy all the air units, the level ends and you move on to the next one, while also getting bonus points by how many trucks survive. For the patch, all I had to do was get 10,000 points, and considering you get 100 points for every aircraft you shoot down, and a lot of bonus points for saving trucks, you can honestly earn the patch pretty quickly after only 3 or 4 levels. I will say though, some of the aircrafts do have some deceptive hitboxes, and they tend to try and bum rush you sometimes as well, so approach each wave carefully, even if you have to move like a slug at times. Better be safe than sorry, as some people say. Number 9, Climber 5. Gamers, I truly must ask you the most important question of all time. What happened to Climbers 1 through 4? Anyway, this game is painfully simple and generic. You start at the lower right of the screen and must climb ladders to get to the top left and activate a button to end each level while also avoiding the moving walls that will kill you on contact. Think Donkey Kong without any sort of inspiring gameplay mechanic. Don't have much to say about this one. It's not very interesting, the sound effects can be really grating at times, and there's not even a patch for this one either. I mean, I'm glad there isn't a patch for this one, because that means I don't have to play any more of this, but still, it seems like it would be fairly easy to make one. Oh well, on to the next game. Number 10, Cosmic Commuter. Okay, we actually got a pretty good one here. The goal for this game is to navigate an asteroid field while picking up passengers on your spaceship. And once you collect them all, you must commute them back to where you landed your ship and blast them out of the meteor war zone. I wasn't really sure how to do this at first, since the instructions were kind of vague and confusing. Plus, there wasn't a patch for this either, so there wasn't really a strong initiative to figure it out. But I wanted to give this one a chance, and I'm glad I did, even if I had to look really hard at the instructions to find the answer. Honestly, this gave me vibes of a very old concept of Crazy Taxi or something, and it actually controlled pretty smoothly as well once you figured out the controls. Really weird that there wasn't a patch for this game though, as this is one that I definitely would have grinded out if there was one. Number 11, Crackpots. Okay, this was honestly another pretty good game, but we finally did have another patch to earn, and this one was actually fairly difficult to manage, as it actually took me a few runs to get this right. Basically, your goal for this is to drop flower pots on a bunch of bugs that are trying to climb the wall into your house. If 6 bugs infiltrate your home, they'll remove a layer of your building, making it a lot smaller and actually kind of making it harder to react to the bugs for future levels, as they get faster and now don't have as much distance to climb. Each level has a different type of bug to deal with. The black and blue bugs are pretty obvious about what opening they're heading towards, and you can generally hit them without timing anything. The red and green bugs, though, are obnoxious, especially the red ones, since they climb diagonally, so you almost need to think 2 lanes to the left or right from where they start ascending. The green bugs are like the blue ones, but they have a wider range of movement, which makes hitting them a lot harder, even though they technically stick to just 1 lane anyway. Like I said, every time you finish a cycle of these colors, the bugs will get faster, but they are also worth more points too. And since there is a patch for this, points are going to be very important for our ultimate goal, especially considering you need 75,000 to get the badge in the first place. This was brutal, not gonna lie, especially since by the third or fourth cycle, the red and green bugs were so hard to manage without pause buffering, which I shamelessly did for this challenge because why the hell not? It was so hard that I actually ended up failing on my first real attempt by only 1,200 points. I was so freaking close, but close just wasn't good enough in this case. I tried again, and thankfully I did get it on one of my next few runs, but I definitely had to work for it. It's also worth mentioning that you get bonus points for minimizing insect house entries in each wave, but by the later rounds it becomes nearly impossible to get a perfect, so best you can do is at least save 2 or 3 hits, just so you can get something for it. But yeah, even though this was hard, it was still a pretty fun arcade-style game, so I'll give it some props at least. Number 12, Activision Decathlon. When I first looked up the stats for this game, I was immediately greeted by the fact that this game had 3 patches to obtain. Although, admittedly, it's all the same patch, just upgraded based on your score. This is because, well, it's a decathlon. Basically a series of track and field events. I honestly think this is a decent addition and a decent game, but damn would I have done a few things differently. For all the running events, you have to alternate the joystick left and right, or in the case of the GBA, the D-pad, and it is just not very comfortable to do that, especially on the final event, which is the 1500 meter dash, which means you have about 3 minutes of straight up button mashing. Not fun in the least bits. And before anyone says, but Slim, it's an endurance event. It's supposed to be tiring. It's a freaking video game. Come the frick on. Let's not even go down that route. It didn't need to be that long or that slow of a task, and I'm not coming off of that hill. Anyway, after going through all 10 events, which are largely just running and sometimes pressing the A button at a certain point to jump or something, you get scored based on your performance in each event, and then get an overall score, and the patch you receive, or don't receive, depends on what your score is, basically a bronze, silver, and gold ranking. This was the first game where I was like, if I don't get the gold patch, I'm probably just going to aim for one of the others and then just move on, because it can be a very long process going through everything, especially with the 1500 meter dash at the end, and various strict timing windows on all the other events, which could easily end a run at any given point in time. In fact, in my second to last run, I was just 51 points short of a bronze patch, and to truly understand how close of a margin that is, my score was basically an average of 854 points per event, and I needed an average of 860, so it was really, really close. On my next attempt though, since my fingers were hurting like hell, I actually remapped my controls a little to make the mashing a little bit less painful, and doing that actually made it significantly easier, as I not only got the bronze patch score, but also the silver one too. I was still a few hundred short of the gold patch though, but I figured silver was good enough to move on. Again, we're just trying to beat these games, not master them. Also, it is worth pointing out that if you do want to fully master this game, you need to get each patch individually, as it didn't actually count my silver run as getting the bronze patch, which was kinda dumb, but whatever, we're finally moving on. Number 13, Dolphin. Oh boy, if you thought I had a lot to say about the last game, well, let's just say it doesn't end there, because this one was also a grind. Say hello to Dolphin, a game where you have to navigate a dolphin through walls of seahorses as it is continually chased by a giant squid. You have a very tiny hole to squeeze through at each impasse, and not a lot of time to react to it either. However, one thing that was kind of unique and cool about this game is that the sound effects actually hint at where the hole is going to be. So the higher the tone, the higher the hole, and the opposite for a lower tone. It's still hard, but hey, I appreciated the novelty here. You can also make contact with the arrows in this game, which symbolize catching a good and bad wave, which can speed you up or slow you down. And the same applies to the squid as well, so keep that in mind if you want to get some distance between you and King Calamari here. And finally, sometimes a seagull will fly above the arena, and if you make contact with it, you will turn invincible. And if you touch the squid in the state, you'll knock it out and get quite a number of bonus points before it respawns, and the difficulty gets slightly higher due to the number of points being gotten. That's essentially how this game works, so let's talk about the patches for this one. There are 2 patches you can get. One for accumulating 80,000 points, and another for getting up to 300,000 points. And let me tell you, getting these thresholds is not easy. The first 10k to 20k points aren't too bad, but after that point, things start to really get difficult when everything feels like they are going in hyper speed mode, and the good waves seriously feel like they spawn directly on top of the squid every single freaking time they appear, meaning you really have to be on your game. Grabbing the seagull is the absolute worst though. When it appears, it starts zooming across the screen and you literally have to jump out of the water at the exact right time because you literally have to be on top of its hitbox for it to count. And if you miss, you've likely hit a wall or 2 seahorses in the process, which means the squid is probably a fraction away from touching you. This game admittedly had me raging a bit, not gonna lie, and it got to a point where I just had to stop playing. The best I could manage playing naturally was only in the 60,000 range, and I still had a ways to go. However, in between sessions of streaming this, I did look up a high score video for this game, as I was naturally curious, and I found a strat that actually made 80,000 look quite free. Instead of trying to predict where each hole was going to be, I just decided to jump over the wall of seahorses every single time. You get slightly less points this way, but it's way more consistent, and if you get a good sense of the timing, you'll never really lose speed, and will be in a good position to attempt grabbing the seagull as well, although it's still not perfect. After only a few short attempts, I made it to 80,000 and got my high score patch. And no, before anyone asks, no way in hell I was going for 30,000. Not a chance in hell. Number 14, Dragster. The long grinds keep on coming as we now have quite the notorious game on this list, although it's not so much the game itself that is notorious, just an individual who has an association with this game. Look up Dragster World Record controversy on YouTube if you want information on this topic. Long story short, long-time world record proven to be fake and illegitimate. But anyway, this game is a very simple drag race exercise, which means you have a very short, straightforward track, and in addition to managing your speed without burning out your engine, you'll need to master gear shifting to optimize and maintain your speed so you can pass the finish line as quickly as possible. As expected, this game has a patch, and the patch time in question is a simple 6 seconds. On one hand, this is a very short game, so it's very easy to try again consecutively without wasting too much time. On the other hand, this time is ridiculously optimized, and incredibly hard to beat, so if you want to grind this out, you will be at this for a while. In fact, in my first stream of this game, I spent easily 2+ hours trying to crack this one, and the best I could manage was a 6.07 on 3 separate occasions. You really have to get everything perfectly, including shifting gears at literally the highest point without burning out, and not letting up on that gas pedal for any reason whatsoever, which is much easier said than done. In fact, during my grinds at this, 2 other fellow GBA challengers, Bread Ghost and Ditto, actually discovered my stream and my GBA challenge at this point, and shared with me their struggles of doing this game as well, so it was nice to know I wasn't alone in putting up with this madness. Which, shoutouts to them and both of their channels as well, especially Bread Ghost, who was very helpful later on for this game, and other games for the GBA challenge. Plus, it's nice to have some people to share this experience with. Anyway, after my third 6.07, I decided to finally stop my stream for the day and come back the following day, where I had infinitely more success. Not only did I get a 6.07 a few more times and more consistently, I also pulled off a 6.04 and even the dreaded 6.01. I was so close to getting this, I could literally taste it. Eventually though, after many attempts, I finally pulled off the magic run and even got a 5.94 to boot, finally ending my torture of this game for good and showing Todd Rogers Hey look, sometimes you don't need to cheat at video games to have success. Just saying. Number 15, Enduro. After the long grinds of the last 3 games, I was really happy to move on to a game that seemed to have much less complexity involved. The goal here is to simply pass other cars on a road with 3 lanes. You have a few hundred cars to pass, which is a lot, no question, and you have an entire day's worth of time to do so, simulated over a time period of like 5 minutes or so. Depending on the layout of other cars, this can be tricky, as sometimes you may not have a lot of time to react, and if you hit another car, you'll lose a lot of speed and likely several placements as well, which significantly decreases your chance of completing your task successfully. You also have different challenges based on the time of day or certain weather patterns. Sometimes the road will be icy and slippery, making it more awkward to change lanes, and at night, visibility will be a lot lower, meaning you have less time to react, so driving slower may be a good idea. Just a lot of things to keep in mind when doing this gauntlet. In order to get the patch for this game, you need to survive 5 days of this, so basically 5 rounds without failure. It's definitely not easy, but really not many of these patches have been easy. After having a few runs that made it to day 3, I finally made it to day 4, and after that failed, in one more attempt I made it through day 4 as well, and was completely surprised by getting the patch. The instructions really made it seem like I had to last through 5 days, not just make it to day 5. But hey, not gonna complain, because this means I can move on. And so, I did. Number 16, Fishing Derby. This one made me happy because no patch for this one. Just a simple fishing competition between you and another player, whether it be computer or human. Also, not too complicated either. You just lower your line into the water, hook a fish, and drag it out to get points, with the first to 100 being the winner. You get more points for aiming for lower fish, but you also have to watch out for the shark that will take fish off of your line. I swear, this shark was definitely on the CPU player's side, as it stayed on my side for a very long period of time. But eventually I persevered and beat the computer player and moved on from this game. It was still pretty fun though, not gonna lie. Number 17, Freeway. Okay, wait a second, didn't we play this already? No, that was Bloody Human Freeway. I can't believe we have a repeat so soon. In this game's defense though, the first game we played was a prototype for this game, and this one actually has a little more going for it. For one, this game actually has an end condition, and it's seeing how many times your character, which is a chicken this time and not a human, can cross the road before time runs out. You can't see the timer, but it's there, and once it's out, your attempts will stop, and your score will be whatever it is at that point. And since this actually has a score system, there is actually a patch this time, and the goal is to get 20 points on either Game 3 or Game 7 before the time runs out. If you get hit by traffic, you won't have to start over, you'll just move one lane back, but that does eat at your time, so you have to be careful. Learning the traffic patterns is crucial if you want to get the patch, and thankfully it's very consistent, so it's really easy to learn the right movements and timings. It only took me 2 or 3 tries, and even on my first attempts I wasn't too far off either, so I didn't have much to improve on. This one was okay, nothing spectacular, but fairly easy to optimize for the patch as well. Number 18, Frostbite. I have to admit, this game was pretty fun. The goal for this one is to build an igloo by jumping across ice platforms to collect ice and avoiding various enemies that will knock you into the water. The biggest annoyance of this game, though, is the game's perspective when it comes to the jump physics. You would think the ice platforms would need to be lined up in parallel fashion to make a jump successfully, but really you're just jumping straight up or down, so you have to be really mindful of that when making the jumps. I had several attempts fail early on as I was trying to get a handle on that, but once I got a feel for it, this was a fun one to grind out, and didn't take too long either to get the patch, just 40,000 points. And the game is pretty friendly with handing out extra lives too, so yeah, this really wasn't that bad. Definitely a highlight of this collection so far. Number 19, Grand Prix. Dang, there's a lot of car racing games in this collection, huh? Thankfully, this one is a little shorter than Enduro, and not as complex and precise as Dragster. Just a matter of getting to the finish line in each course as fast as you can. the high score being your time. You can get the patch by basically beating a specific time on any course, which obviously means I chose the first course because it's the shortest and only 35 seconds. Now, avoiding cars in this while going fast is not easy by any stretch, but thankfully the opposing cars will universally be on the same global cycle in every attempt, so it's fairly easy to learn a route and get the time no problem. After getting the patch, I did the other courses just to try them out, but ultimately I was glad I stuck with the first course for the patch. The other courses are just way too long and have way too many obstacles. Number 20, Hero. Now, let's talk about a very intriguing Atari game. This one was another standout for me, and I really liked how it was set up. Basically, you have to navigate a cave and look for trapped workers to save. You can fly and hover around with a jetpack, and also use dynamite to blow open walls to get through, and a small blaster of sorts to shoot enemies. It was really a neat game, and I enjoyed playing it. Really the only downside was getting your jetpack to ascend, as it takes a second or two before it registers that input, which can throw you off if you're trying to make a very specific movement in a later stage, or trying not to descend too far while dropping. Once again, the patch goal here was to reach another high score threshold, and this one was 75,000 points, so pretty easy to do. Only took me 2 run attempts, but yeah, another really fun game from the Activision library. Number 21, Ice Hockey. I'm always really picky when it comes to sports games, just because sometimes the AI can be just too pro for their own good. Thankfully, this was not one of those times. A really simple and basic hockey game where if you want the patch, you just have to beat the computer, and I was easily able to do this on my first attempt too. Although, to be fair, with no programmable goalie in this game, it's kind of a freebie, because all you have to do is get through 2 players and take the shots. The shot can be hard to aim properly, but as long as you get right in front of the goal, it should in theory go in every single time. Really nothing more to say here. It's a pretty simple game, but it was kind of fun, I guess. Number 22, Kaboom. This game was a little weird, and surprisingly there wasn't a patch for this one either, which is strange considering it is a high score game. The goal for this is to move your formation of kabobbers, I guess, down the board in an effort to catch the red kabobber. Along the way, you'll have other creatures to contend with that can eat your kabobbers if you don't move carefully. Some will attack more aggressively, and some will move more quickly than you. And if they move first, they can potentially eat your guys. However, if you get the jump on them, you will eat them instead and recruit some additional guys that you can add whenever you're ready for them. Maybe the reason why they didn't add a patch for this is because of how exploitable a high score could be. Or maybe the game ends too early or something. I honestly don't know, and I actually moved on pretty quickly from this one because there wasn't a patch in the first place. It was a pretty interesting idea and concept though, potentially one I could go back to later on if I had a desire to try more of it, but for GBAs I felt this was good enough to get a good enough idea of it. Also, after doing some research, apparently this game was a prototype that wasn't universally released, which is why there wasn't a patch for it, which I guess is good to know. Number 23, Kaboom. Wow, we're not even halfway through the list yet, and there's quite a number of difficult challenges here in just the first half of the game. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to Kaboom, probably one of the more well-renowned games of the entire Atari system. In this game, you have a small stack of buckets that you must use to catch bombs that are being tossed directly at you, and you simply move your stack left or right to intercept them. At first glance, this seems like a pretty simple task, but trust me, you've seen nothing yet. To get the patch for this, you have to catch 3,000 points worth of bombs, and at the beginning, you only get 1 point per bomb, and only 10 points for the first round. Thankfully, these values will exponentially get bigger, and in reality, you may only have to sit through around 9 or 10 rounds at the end of the day if you want to get your completion reward. However, here's the problem. By round 5, this task already started to feel pretty impossible, and beyond the capabilities of normal human response, because your reaction time really needs to be on point here, and the left and right movements of the D-pad just don't cut it sometimes, especially since the hitboxes are pretty strict as well. I tried this so many times and only managed to get through round 5 twice without losing a life. And here's a further problem. When you lose a life, your task gets harder because your stack of buckets gets smaller, and you move back a level so you get penalized with less points in the process. And I still needed to get around 2,500 points to even get the badge in the first place. You can hold the R button while moving your D-pad, and that will speed up your movements a lot, almost to the point where you can spam left or right inputs and easily beat some of the mid to late rounds, but the bombs drop so fast by level 6 and 7 that it just feels practically unsurmountable to get this patch, at least with normal human ability. So I'll be real with you, this was another patch I skipped out on. I know I got the silver patch in decathlon and the first Dolphin badge, so at least with those I accomplished something, but this just fell out of my technical and human ability. Also, it is worth mentioning that this game technically required a paddle accessory to play on the Atari to begin with, which shows me that this game was already not meant to be played in this fashion regardless, which is another reason that I feel kind of justifies my decision to move on from this. I did give it an honest effort though, and during one of my attempts I did get 1,000 points, which was enough to get an extra life. Unfortunately, I was too far into the mix that the extra life was discarded immediately after the insane speeds of level 5 and 6. So rest in peace to that safety. Also, I did a little test on a different emulator with save states. Apparently if you get an extra life when you already have 3 buckets, they won't stack. So if you have 3 lives, get 1,000 points, and then fail immediately, you'll still only have 2 lives remaining, meaning it's almost better to lose a bucket at 999, get 1 point, and get your 3rd bucket back again, as opposed to losing it after 1,000, which is kind of silly in retrospect. Also, I noticed that different emulators have different response times and input lag for this game too. Even though I was using save states, I found that movement was so much smoother in the program without save states. So even my little test run was giving me problems, which made me feel like no matter what, I just couldn't win with this game. But yeah, that was Kaboom. Honestly, despite its patch difficulty, I do think it's a solid idea for a game, and I would be curious to feel how the game controls with the paddle accessory that was made with this game in mind. Forget trying to master this one though, at least in this collection and for this challenge. Although, funnily enough, in other versions of Activision Anthology, the point requirement for this patch actually got lowered, so why the hell did that not happen with this game? No idea. Number 24, Keystone Capers. This was another cool but tricky one, but only in the sense that it can intensify pretty quickly. The idea is you're a cop chasing a bad guy throughout this shopping center, I guess? You start moving left from the right, and then you climb an escalator to get to the next floor, and then just keep following the path up until you catch the bad guy. Along the way, you have to avoid various obstacles from bouncing balls, to shopping carts, to toy planes, and the obstacles intensify after each time you succeed. Sometimes their patterns become more erratic, sometimes they just get faster, basically anything to slow your ascent down. The sooner you make it to the thief, the more bonus points you get, but you can also lose points by touching the impediments, so keep that in mind. In order to get the patch for this one, you need to get 35,000 points. I honestly had some trouble with this, where when I got to a certain level, it almost became too hard to complete quickly, since the obstacles became frame perfect to dodge, and each screen transition was a bit longer for the added time you needed to react appropriately to each obstacle. There is an elevator you can take as well, but it's a bit of a risk with how long you have to wait for it, and the bad guy can turn around if you land directly on his floor, so it should only be used really if it's right there waiting for you, or will arrive at the next floor just after the guy crosses through it. I eventually got a good run though and completed this for the patch, and like I said, it was pretty fun. Definitely got repetitive after a while, and I kinda wish the difficulty scaling upwards was a little smoother, but nothing that made it feel unobtainable like the previous game. Number 25, Laser Blast. I hope you guys like space shooters, because Atari had a bunch of them on this console. Heck, this wasn't even the first one in this collection, and it will definitely not be the last one either. This is a pretty simple one though. You essentially have to gun down 3 turret guns before they gun you down. Once you do so, you move on to the next wave and keep going until you run out of lives. This is very repetitive, especially if you want to go for the patches in this game. And yes, I said patches, as in multiple ones. There are only 2 though, but they are both locked behind quite a number of rounds. To get the first one, you need 100,000 points, but to get the second, you need a cold million. Essentially 10 times the amount for the first patch. And the first is already pretty time consuming. How time consuming? Well, let's just say at a certain point, you only get 90 points per shooting down each enemy, and that's the max too. And I don't think you get too many bonus points for clearing waves either, so roughly only about 500 points per wave. That's a long time to stick around on this. Thankfully though, the enemy AI doesn't really improve much, and you get extra lives pretty quickly after each 1,000 points, so even if you get some bad RNG, you can pretty quickly recover from it. Also, it seems like each wave has a scripted attack pattern chosen at random, as I noticed at one point I was consistently getting shot down after a pattern where the most right-handed gun always seemed to fire at exactly where I was after shooting down the first two enemies. They don't seem to do the patterns 2 times in a row though, so I was usually able to recover and get my lost life back without losing too much at the end of the day. Basically, I was getting lives faster than I was losing them. It was a long grind, but I did finally get the first patch. No way in hell I was going for the second one though. I didn't mind the game too much. It's a nice test of reflexes, but gets repetitive very quickly, and I was just not about to sit for an additional hour or two to get the second patch. Just saying. Number 26, Mega Mania. Hey look, another space shooter, although this one is laid out a bit more like other space shooters I enjoy and have played at a younger age, like Space Invaders for example. You really just move around and shoot things in space. That's really about it, honestly. Each level has a set of objects you have to shoot down, and you get points for not only shooting them, but also for finishing each wave fast enough so you get time bonus points. The longer you go on and progress, the more dangerous these objects will become, but also the more points they're worth as well, which means each additional stage can really inflate that score. And once again, we need a total of 45,000 points if we want to get the patch for this game. It honestly wasn't too hard, nothing like some of the other challenges I've done in this game, but once again, some rounds can definitely be a bit stressful since the objects move really fast, and I'm not really a fan of the game's targeting system. You see, after shooting your weapon, you can actually move the missile along with your spacecraft, meaning that it always stays directly in front of you as opposed to Space Invaders, where it just shoots straight upwards. This threw me off a little bit, not to mention that the projectiles are also quite small to boot, so it was really hard to aim properly on this one. Not to mention, some levels just felt impossible without taking a hit to one of your lives. Like I said though, with how much bonus points can inflate your score, along with just the general progression, the patch score isn't too bad, as I only made it through one cycle of objects and about half of another cycle, so it was a fairly generous score amount at the end of the day. Just takes a little bit of patience with the game and its mechanics, that's all. Number 27, Oink. I'm gonna assume you know the story of the 3 little pigs. Basically, there's some pigs living in houses, there's a big bad wolf, and lots of chaos ensues as a result of that. Honestly, this was a pretty clever game. The wolf is making holes at your house, and you have to drop materials on the holes in an effort to not make them bigger, or reduce the spaces as much as possible, as if there is a large enough space, the wolf can drag the poor little piggy to him and end one of your 3 lives. You have to act fast, but also be somewhat strategic with which materials you choose to go for. Go for the furthest away materials first, just so you can get them out of the way, and that way you can spam drop a bunch of the others when you're right above the biggest space in the building, severely limiting the wolf's progress. Also, just try to make sure there isn't a direct line from you to the wolf in general, unless absolutely necessary. Every little bit of time counts in this one, especially if you're going for the patch score. In this game, the score is only 25,000, but don't get too comfortable or overconfident, because it can still be kind of tricky if you aren't prepared for this one. My first few runs didn't come close, but once I had a good start with another one, I feel like I got the score pretty easily. This is another case where the longer you go on, the more points you get from just general progression, and trust me, they seriously increase exponentially in this one too, so having a good start is paramount for getting the patch. Trust me. Number 28, Oki. Wow, we're finally at the halfway point, and we can rest a bit easy because we don't have a patch for this one. and it's not a very complicated game either. So this in theory should be a quick clear. This is actually a puzzle game, which, yeah, I know, Pieces Game of the Year, but this isn't so much a jigsaw puzzle, rather a consecutive button puzzle. I'm honestly not sure what you would call these, but think of this as the Magic Buttons puzzle from Super Mario RPG, or the final little puzzle you have to do before entering the final egg in Sonic Adventure. Basically, you select an object or a space, and when you do so, that space, along with any adjacent spaces, will switch positions. And the goal for this game is to essentially make it so every object in the field is turned off. If you don't really pay attention to what you're doing, this can take a really long time to solve if you try to brute force yourself through it. Heck, it took me over 1,000 moves to get this one right, although I did get very close a number of times with only 2 or 1 piece left. You almost have to use the same kind of logic that you would to use to solve a Rubik's Cube, and thinking about a future game on this list, it's kind of funny I made that connection here. But basically the idea is making a few alterations based on positions of a single instance in an effort to not only switch that instance around, but not switching around too many other instances either, if that makes sense. It is probably easier than a Rubik's Cube though, but can still require a bit of knowledge and brain power to plan too far in advance, especially with how many spaces there are here to begin with. Like I said, there's no patch for this, so I just solved one of them and left it at that. There are quite a number of preset puzzles for this one though. I just solved the first one because that was the only one that had a high score slot in the game's high score menu. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Number 29, Oystron. Another game that strangely doesn't have a patch, although I think I learned later that the reason some of these don't have patches is because they were either prototypes, unreleased games, or just games that were made as homebrew titles outside of Activision, so obviously they wouldn't have had an Activision patch to give out. Anyway, it's another space shooter, but this one's a bit more complicated. Essentially you're shooting asteroids and other space weirdos to obtain pearls. And the more pearls you collect and store in your lanes, the more bombs you'll get in the process. And these bombs are necessary to destroy the almighty Oystron, a weird symbol that only appears if you advance far enough in space to reach the Oystron phase. Basically, if the meter at the bottom fills all the way up. Now, I'm not going to show this to you guys because, I'll be real, the developers did not consider those who might deal with epilepsy because the screen flashes in an incredibly brutal fashion during these periods of time, and I'm not going to subject you guys to any of that. So just take my word for it and be careful and brace yourself if you ever decide to play this in the future. But at the end of the day, this game didn't even have a patch, so I didn't really have a lot keeping me around for it. I did like how it had a unique premise and wasn't just another basic space shooter, so at least it had that going for it. But it was also kind of confusing at first, and I really had to scan the manual to figure out how to play this, and even that didn't really explain everything to me either. So yeah, that's basically all I have to say here. Number 30, Pitfall. Probably the one game in this anthology that needs no introduction, as it's probably the only game that actually has a continuation outside of this collection. In fact, we'll actually play a game or two from this franchise later on during GBAce as it is, so probably for the best that we get familiar with its roots now. Basically, you control Pitfall Harry as he explores the landscape looking for treasure. You have 20 minutes to collect as much treasure as possible without dying too many times, might I add. And whenever your run ends, no matter how it ends, your score is your final treasure collection rating. And let me tell you, there is actually such a thing as a perfect game for this. If you somehow manage a perfect score of 114,000, you will essentially 100% the game. But let me tell you, that is no easy feat, because there are long stretches of screens you have to navigate through where you'll have to jump over logs and enemies and swing over deadly pits. And every time you hit specific obstacles, you will lose treasure. So if you want to truly master this game, you need to not only survive the long endurance of collecting everything, but also avoid every single obstacle in your path. Thankfully, the patch score for this game is not that brutal. All you need is 20,000 points, and although it took me a few attempts to get adjusted to everything and how to avoid specific obstacles, I was able to get it done after a while and secure my victory. Honestly, this was a pretty fun game, and I can see how this game has the legacy that it does. It has some Atari jank in terms of awkward hitboxes and very strict jump timings, but hey, this game was made almost 40 years ago, so I guess I can understand the limitations. Honestly, it was a fun game to play, not gonna lie. Number 31, Pitfall II. And what a coincidence, the sequel is on this collection too. And let me tell you, I was not expecting the sequel to go so hard. This game has evolved quite a bit from the first game, and although I wouldn't say the jump is as drastic as Zelda 1 to Link to the Past, it's still pretty incredible what is featured here. For one, the time limit is gone as well as the extra lives, and the game actually features save points now, or rather restore points if you happen to take a death at any point in your quest. Your goal is to still collect treasure, but you have to do so in a giant underground maze. And more than that, there are 3 special items you can obtain, where if you get them all, the game actually finishes, meaning there is actually an endpoint here, which is kinda neat. The patch for this game isn't reaching the end though, it's just getting 99,000 points, and although that is larger than the first game's 20,000 requirement, trust me, this is not that much harder. There are lots of treasure pickups here, and the main items are worth 10,000 points by themselves, and I managed to actually get the patch before I even got the first item, or at the very least, it could be obtained in that fashion. You still have to be careful though, because every time you die or get damaged, you get sent back to your last restore point, and depending on how long ago that was, you could lose a lot of treasure on the way back. So be very careful on your long gauntlets. Even though I got the patch easily, I still actually challenged myself to beat the game in the traditional way, and I did succeed even with some really bad annoyances. Basically, the same issues I had with Pitfall 1 were present here as well, and that comes down to just janky hitboxes. There were some enemies and enemy patterns that just seemed impossible, if not just really obnoxious to dodge, and that held me up a lot in finishing this. After a bit of persistence though, I was able to get Harry's girl Rhonda, a beautiful engagement ring, and a Cheetahman, apparently? I don't know, a pretty weird item to end on, I guess. Point is, I was able to succeed, and I was generally satisfied with what I played. Seriously, this game almost felt like a prelude to the Metroidvania genre to an extent. Obviously with less item gating, but still, the world map definitely had that kind of vibe to it. And that's really impressive for an Atari game. Definitely a highlight of this collection for sure. Number 32, Plaque Attack. I feel bad for those who get a bit queasy and uneasy when it comes to dental work, because after all the procedures I've had to have over the last few years, this one was a bit uncomfortable for me. Basically, this is a space shooter that takes place in a person's mouth. You have to shoot down sweets and greasy food with toothpaste, I guess? And do so before they latch on to any of the teeth in the top or bottom of the mouth. It starts off pretty simple at first, but honestly, this gets pretty fast really quickly. And what doesn't make it easier is the fact that you can actually change the direction of your tube of toothpaste, so you're not just firing in one direction. Moving around like this can be pretty complicated, especially if you're just trying to move yourself in one direction while still firing in the opposite direction, as you'll have to give yourself some leeway to turn back around once you get there. Thankfully though, your toothpaste doesn't take contact damage, and you do get bonus teeth every 2,000 points, and the more rounds you clear with a lot of teeth on the table will give you a lot of bonus points. Enough to make the 35,000 point requirement for the patch relatively easy to access. Number 33, Pressure Cooker. It's funny that I've spent so much of the last few years playing Overcooked, because this is like the prototype for Overcooked. Basically, you're making burgers for your hungry customers. Each burger is cooked for you, but you have the all-important job of placing condiments on each sandwich to match the orders given at the bottom of the screen. It starts off pretty easy at first, only needing one ingredient per order, but as you advance you'll have orders with 2 or 3 condiments, or sometimes all of them, and since the game gets faster, it gets relatively more difficult to finish these orders in a timely fashion. Although technically you aren't really timed here, you're actually given a chef rating instead, and the goal is to not let that rating plummet to 0. However, that rating can drop if you let any ingredients go to waste, or you don't construct the order properly, so you'll have to be quick, efficient, attentive, and precise with how you manage your shift. Honestly, my biggest issue with this game is how you handle ingredients. The condiments literally get fired at you, like out of a cannon, and they do so in a random manner. Usually it'll try to prioritize stuff you need at first, but there is no guarantee of that, so you have to be aware of what you need at every move. If you get something you don't need, even if it is something you don't need yet, you have to reflect it by running into it while holding the fire button. However, if you do need it, you'll have to just run into it to catch it, and then place it on the order. However, both of these actions can be very precise. Sometimes if you aren't angled properly, you won't catch it, and will splatter, giving you a rating penalty. And if you accidentally catch something, you actually can't get rid of it, and need to place it on a burger, which will either mess up an order you have on the table already, or you have to pray that an upcoming order will have that ingredient in it. Otherwise, you will just end up getting a bigger penalty for wasting a whole burger. This actually made the patch for 45,000 points kind of difficult to obtain, because while I was getting a handle and grasp of this game, one slight mistake in just one round could very easily slow my progress down for this goal, and in some cases just end the run earlier than I expected it to. However, after a few tries, I finally got a good rundown and achieved my patch with relative ease. But yeah, this was a pretty good game, another one I really enjoyed, and I probably have Overcooked to thank for that. Number 34, Private Eye. Brace yourself, guys, because we have another Activision game that I actually kind of enjoyed. The goal for this game is that you're a police detective who is trying to solve a case across the city. There are 5 different cases you can choose from, and each case pretty much controls in the same fashion, but each one definitely gets more difficult due to the map layout. You essentially have to find a lost or stolen item and return it to its place of origin. Then find the second item, do the same thing, and then finally find the criminal and take him to the police station. You have to do these little fetch quests one at a time though, so your best course of action is really just to memorize the map layout and find the shortest path from point A to point B to point C, and so on. And optimize your route and gameplay along the way, as you'll have to avoid obstacles that will slow you down as well. Each case has a time limit too, so you have to do it fast if you want to succeed, so keep that in mind. The patch goal for this game was just to complete Case 3, and I'm kind of surprised since I figured 4 and 5 would have been harder, but hey, no complaints from me, as it allows me to complete this game quicker than I initially thought I would have to. Before I attempted the patch, I tried Case 1 and 2 first, and while 1 was pretty simple, I was already starting to see some issues with number 2. You see, the map is not just one street, it's multiple, and you can connect to different roads by traveling through the middle path of the screen as one to do so. However, this is not so much a path as it is a warp of sorts. In other words, don't try to map this out, because you may get more confused than anything looking at your notes. I honestly had to watch a video for the correct paths, and even then, the route for case number 3 is absolutely insane, and it literally makes every second of the round count, as I finished pretty much every case with only a second or 2 left. With that being said, I was able to get it done though, so that felt nice. It can be a real hard game to optimize though, but I did enjoy the general concept of it. It just needed a little more leeway with dodging obstacles and a more sensible map system, I think. Number 35, River Raid. We're jumping back into flying vehicles again, and also another arcade shooter of sorts. In this game, you're flying along a giant stretch of a river, and you must destroy many of the things in your path. Boats, other flying machines, bridges. If it's in your way, you can destroy it. Just don't destroy the fuel canisters, as you need those to keep your own machine flying. The basic patch goal for this game was 15,000 points, and it honestly wasn't that hard to manage either. You just need to be quick and decisive, but also careful and calculated to make sure you don't get hit along the way. I will say though, some of the spaces you have to move into can feel really super tight sometimes, and in some cases, collisions with the other obstacles seem almost impossible to avoid, which really made this more difficult than what you would think it would be. It wasn't a super high threshold to meet though, so it didn't take me too many extra tries at least. Pretty decent game overall. Number 36, River Raid 2. Normally you would expect a sequel game to be better. I mean, that was actually the case with Pitfall anyway. But I don't know, I didn't really enjoy River Raid 2 as much as I did the original. I think they just got a bit too carried away with adding too much extra unnecessary stuff, and it honestly made it more difficult to play personally. You actually have to take off the runway in this version, so an extra step to even get the run going. The fuel canisters also turn into friendly planes you have to make contact with, which honestly just kind of confused me, as I thought they were enemies at first. Eventually you get to the actual river, where the game starts to look like River Raid again, but still, it just didn't really feel the same. You can still try to aim for getting a lot of points, I guess, but here's the thing, this game doesn't even have a patch. I guess it just released a little too late into the system's lifespan, that they didn't create one or something. But either way, my point stands. I didn't really have anything to aim for here. Plus, in addition to taking off, you also have to land in this game too, which I found kind of hard to do for some reason. I landed a few times, but I wasn't slowing down enough, which just caused me to take off again when I reached the end of the carrier ship. Eventually I got it though, and considered that my completion requirement for this game. I completed a full cycle. That should be good enough, right? Also, there are some really annoying enemies in this game that just kind of pop out of nowhere and can easily catch you off guard too. And the worst part is, you can't really even destroy them either. So that was another aspect of this game that just didn't sit well with me. So yeah, this one was kind of a stinker for me personally. Not the worst, but further from the best. Number 37, Robot Tank. This game kind of reminds me of the old arcade game called Battlezone, where basically the objective is to shoot tanks before they shoot you, and yeah, that's pretty much what we have here. Now, this game can be kind of tricky. Sometimes you can get a lucky break and shoot down a tank before it even has a chance to fire at you, and have back-to-back luck and success with being a quick draw. But most of the time, they'll go aggro on you the second you step in their line of vision, and you have to be very careful with how you dodge their projectiles, because their aim is honestly pretty solid. More than that, the game also has random weather patterns from fog, snow, and rain that can heavily impact your movement and capabilities. Not to mention nighttime can be a concern from being able to even see the enemies in the first place. And the worst is when the night is combined with one of the other weather effects. Ooh boy, that can be rough. There is also another saving grace in the fact that if you get shot, sometimes the hit won't be lethal, and you'll just have one of your parts damaged as opposed to losing a life. However, having a damaged part can be just as dangerous as losing one of your main conveniences, like your radar or the ability to turn as easily, basically making you feel like more of a sitting duck. Anyway, in regards to this game's patch, there are actually 3 of them for this game, and they're pretty much progressive, as you get one for destroying 48 tanks, one for destroying 60 tanks, and one for 72 tanks, basically surviving 4, 5, and 6 rounds respectively. I only set the completion goal for getting the first patch, which I did succeed with during my first run. Maybe I'll come back for the other 2 later on though in my spare time, because I did find this kind of fun honestly. Number 38, Sequest. At first this game reminded me of a more horizontal Plaque Attack, but in reality it's just another shooter game, so really nothing that special. You're in an underwater submarine and you have to rescue your fellow treasure divers from the briny deep as they're being chased and assaulted by fish and other hostile enemy subs. You get points by shooting these hostile forces, and by also saving 6 divers by collecting them and taking them to the surface, where if you do so, the round will end and you will get bonus points based on how many you save and how much oxygen your sub has left. Now, you can also restore oxygen by getting your sub to the surface without saving 6 guys, but I found this incredibly random and risky to do so, as sometimes it made the round end prematurely, and other times there was a hostile sea craft that patrols the surface that will make you lose a life if it runs into you. And if you're in the middle of the automated cutscene of your sub filling up or releasing passengers, it will still count as a lost life, so be very careful. Anyway, the patch for this game is 50,000 points, which does seem like a lot, but considering it's a rather simple game, it gives plenty of bonus lives if you score enough points, and the general point values get better the longer you last. So as long as you focus when you get that run going, it shouldn't be that bad to manage. Number 39, Skateboarding. Well, this game should give me some good practice for the Tony Hawk games when they ultimately pop up for this challenge. So yeah, this is Skateboarding, a game where you just skate around a parking lot and perform tricks. This game doesn't have a patch, but I did set a completion goal for this one, where I just had to complete a round by fulfilling every objective, which is basically jumping every ramp and going through every tube tunnel. There is a counter for this game that keeps track of this information, so just go around, memorize all the locations, and hit each one in the 5 minutes you have for this challenge. It did take me a few attempts to manage this, just because the map is very maze-like in appearance, plus I had a really hard time going through the tube tunnels since you have to be crouching, and you need to hit the tunnel just right for it to count. Otherwise, you will crash and have to try it again. However, for the most part, it was a decent game, and I appreciated what I played of it. Not my favorite, but far from the worst. Number 40, Skeleton Plus. A very simple game where you navigate a 3D maze and shoot skeletons. That's really about it. Once again, no patch for this, although you could look at surviving and taking down all 99 skeletons, a completion goal for this game. I, however, did not, because it can be a very slow process, and I'll admit, staring at this game for too long did mess with my eyes a bit, since the visuals for this one are definitely very primitive for its time. It was a pretty innovative idea for a game, though, as you use the sound effects to locate the skeletons in the maze, as the louder and faster they are, the closer they are to you. A great use of sound to enhance the gameplay, I must say, kinda like Dolphin in a lot of respects. But yeah, I basically just played this until I lost. A pretty typical stipulation for a high score game of this nature. Number 41, Skiing. It was only a matter of time before we returned to the time trial challenges, because now we have this game, a downhill skiing exercise where you must navigate your skier around obstacles and through slalom gates in an effort to get the best time. There are a number of preset courses, including a setting with randomized course layouts, but if you want to get the patch here, you have to beat course 3 in under 28.2 seconds. Much like Dragster, this time is very tight, and you have to optimize every movement down to the very T. But at least it's easier to see the effects of your movements, unlike Dragster was. The biggest tip I can give you here is try to stay as parallel to the slope as possible, as the straighter your position, the faster you'll go down the hill, and if you simply memorize the flag layouts, you can find very long stretches of hill where you don't need to turn at all, vital for getting the best time. It took a lot of attempts, not as many as Dragster thankfully, and even after a lot of very close calls where I was hundreds of a second away, I did ultimately succeed here and got my patch, so huzzah! Also, in addition to the slalom courses, there are some downhill distance courses as well, where you don't have to worry about slalom gates and you just need to try to get to the bottom of the hill. But there wasn't a patch for these, so I just did one of them and left it at that. And thankfully, there wasn't a scary Yeti that came out of nowhere to eat you like that other old skiing game. Number 42, Skyjinx. From one time trial game to another, as we now have Skyjinx. Try to look at this like Barnstorming, the very first game we played, but from a more horizontal perspective, as your goal is to veer left and right around pylons and try to get to the end of the course in the shortest amount of time possible, with each pylon miss adding time as a penalty. The time requirement for this was 37 seconds for the patch, and while this seemed to be a tough goal at first, it honestly didn't take me too many tries. The trick is not just course memorization, but also tight turning around the pylons, in an effort to prepare for each consecutive one, while also speeding up at the right points where your turns won't need to be as drastic. It's just a matter of getting a feel for it, and once you do, it's really not so bad. Heck, probably the easiest of these time trial challenges to begin with. Number 43, Space Shuttle. I was warned about this one from Bread Ghost, who I talked about earlier, and I finally understand why. This is an absolutely brutal game to complete. Activision actually made this space shuttle simulator with help from NASA themselves, and look, I respect the ambition and the authenticity of this game's design, but dear lord did I absolutely have zero idea of what I was supposed to do for this one. They literally made this just as complicated as actually piloting a space shuttle, and if you don't believe me, look at the actual manual for this game. It's easily 10 times the length of any other game in this collection, and even after spending like 10 minutes in the actual instructions trying to get a grasp of what I was doing, I wasn't retaining anything. So I just opted to read a guide by Video Game Fan 1 on GameFAQs. And trust me, it helped a lot more than the manual ever would. Basically, your goal for this challenge is to launch a space shuttle and have it dock and rendezvous with a satellite in orbit. After the rendezvous, you send the shuttle back home to land on the ground. Along the way, though, you have to complete every phase of this process and complete it in a very exact manner. Matching the trajectory of your flight path, maintaining your speed and position with respect to the satellite you're trying to dock, deploying all the different functions of your spacecraft at just the right time. Literally everything shy of smelling the inside of the actual shuttle you have to do here for this game, and it's pretty intimidating. In fact, due to the limited number of buttons on an Atari joystick in comparison with the number of functions you have to perform, even switches and buttons like the color display and the difficulty switches have functionality unique to this game, and it can be quite a lot to memorize. And that's another reason why the Game Facts Guide was very, very helpful for me. You essentially have 6 phases you have to get through. The launch phase, which basically gets you off the ground and into the atmosphere. The stabilizing orbit phase, which basically assures you enter orbit successfully as you approach the satellite. Then you have the docking phase, which is apparently the hardest, but I actually got pretty lucky with this, probably because I was super careful. Basically, this is where you try to match not only the speed, but also the position of the satellite so you can dock with it. Apparently it's super precise though, so you really have to scrutinize your movements here. Then, after docking successfully, you start the deorbiting phase, then the re-entry phase, and finally the landing. Honestly, I personally felt like launch was the hardest part of this. It's very specific with when you have to do your movements, and once you get off the ground, you have to make sure your flight path is stable with the lines on your radar while also matching your fuel meter with the other meter in the middle. It's a lot to pay attention to at once, and then when you do get to a specific altitude, you have to press something else to make sure that the whole process wasn't for naught in the first place. Once you get past that though, I feel like it gets a lot easier, although maybe a little more stressful because you don't want to do all that over again. Orbiting and deorbiting is pretty simple, as it's just a simple order of button presses, and I talked about docking earlier, so next up is re-entry, which is basically just the reverse launch phase. It's honestly a bit easier though, as you don't have to worry about fuel management here, but there is a point where the game screen starts flashing and stuff on your radar starts to disappear, which is a little scary at first, but if you keep things online for the most part, you should be fine. Finally, you have the landing, and honestly it's not too bad if you pay attention to your instructions. Once you're lined up with the runway, it's just a matter of releasing your landing gear at the right time and pulling back on your joystick to finish things up. However, in my first run at this phase, What? I failed the mission when I was literally seconds away from completing my journey because I took my eye off the radar for just a second and didn't realize I wasn't positioned properly with my landing trajectory. So I had to do the entire journey all over again, even though I was already on the ground. It was brutal and demoralizing for sure, but thankfully the second run went a lot faster and I was able to keep my cool for a bit longer. Then, when I reached the landing phase again, I landed my spacecraft and completed the mission with a very, very welcome homecoming. Game complete. Okay, so I made the difficult journey. Surely that is worth a patch, right? Well, here's the thing. If you want to get a patch for this game, you have to dock with the satellite a total of 4 times during one run, which means after docking once, you have to go back to the stabilizing orbit phase and proceed to the docking phase again, and then do that multiple times in a row before making your journey home. Not only that, but you also have to have a certain amount of fuel at your disposal as well when you finish, 4,500 to be exact. This was something I admittedly didn't pay much attention to in this run, because at this point I just wanted to complete the mission, not overachieve here. And you want to know the funny part? That's only one of 2 patches you have for this game. That's right, there is a second patch for this game that requires you to dock 6 times, and also in the mission with a total of 7,500 fuel. Safe to say, I did not go for either of these. The game was hell to learn, and I'm still clueless on a lot of the aspects of it. Much of my knowledge is just from following the guide's instructions down to a T, not even knowing the reasoning or the indicators behind each step. I just did it because the guide told me to. That's all. But yeah, that was my adventure with Space Shuttle. I really do respect the amount of work and authenticity that went into this, and I'm sure someone who goes into this kind of work can really appreciate what the game tried to accomplish. Seriously, the idea is really remarkable for its time. However, as a casual gamer, this is way too much, and I don't ever see myself touching this game ever again. It did make quite the story though, and was easily one of the biggest and longest sagas of the Activision Anthology experience. Not the longest though, but still quite memorable. Number 44, Space Shuttle 2. I'm just kidding, there's no Space Shuttle 2. I had you go in there for a second though. Number 44, Space Treat Deluxe. Okay, we're still in outer space, but thankfully this game is a lot easier and more up my alley. In fact, it's kind of like Freeway again, so another Frogger clone. The object of this game is to make it to the opposite side of the screen, trying to avoid the space traffic in between by moving from lane to lane. Once you grab the sweet treat at the end, you must move back to your docking station to complete the level. And that's pretty much it, really. Once you get to level 3, you will also have to grab a key that will open up the door to the sweet treat, so there is one extra step involved. You also have a fuel meter, which is basically a built-in time limit for each level, so you gotta make it back before that runs out as well. There are 99 levels here, but thankfully there is no patch for this game, so it's basically just a high score contest. I did a few runs and didn't make it too far into the game, but I did do enough levels to make the level rewards cycle around again, so I guess you could say that was my completion here. But yeah, this game was fine. Probably the best Freeway clone that exists in this collection. Not that that's really saying too much anyway. Number 45, Spider Fighter. Hey look, another Space Invaders-like shooter. Atari was literally a haven for these types of games, huh? Anyway, the main takeaway from this one is that this is probably the hardest one so far. The concept is simple, just fire at the moving ships and take them out before they take you out. The first ship that appears in each wave is the mothership of sorts, as they'll summon lots of smaller enemies and try to take away your precious fruit stash in the top right, so try to take them out quickly so they don't cause any issues. However, the enemies they release can be quite dangerous as well. They can shoot really fast, and sometimes they default close to the bottom of the screen anyway, giving you very little time to react before they just pop you out of existence, just like that. Each round is a series of waves you have to take down, and once you take down them all, assuming all of your fruit are still intact, you'll get an extra life, or bonus points if you're already at max lives. At least extra lives are generous despite the brutality of this game, practically a necessity for this game to begin with. Getting the patch for this game, basically a score of 40,000, was rough, and not just because of how fast the enemies are. The speed is definitely an issue, don't get me wrong, but even when I found the strategy of hugging the left wall, as that's usually the location of where enemies spawn in, I was still not really getting a lot of points for this one, as they didn't exponentially increase to the levels as other games did. By the time I reached 20,000, I was already getting destroyed quite handedly by the enemy. It was just that fast, and I felt that I needed to be almost part machine to keep up with this. However, after browsing the manual, I discovered that the game's expert mode actually did give exponentially higher points per round. So I took the little extra difficulty in an effort to get a faster patch, which ultimately did help me acquire another one for my collection. Also, the button mashing for this game really sucked, and it really tired out my hands if I'm being honest. Number 46, Stampede. This one was actually pretty cool. In this game, you are a cowboy trying to herd cattle in a giant stampede, and your goal is to lasso up as many bovines as possible before letting too many go by, trying to see how many points you can get in the overall session. Now, while this game is fun, it can be a little difficult to get the patch, as there's quite a bit of RNG with this one. Each cattle brand, in addition to having different point values, also has a different movement speed and pattern, and you have about 5 or 6 lanes to manage, so it can be quite intimidating for those who get easily overwhelmed by a lot to pay attention to and a lot going on. The biggest factors being the Black Angus cattle, which don't move at all, and can't be pushed forward, so you pretty much have to catch them when they appear, otherwise you lose points and potentially stumble around for the others too, losing more cattle in the process. The hitbox for the lasso is also kind of weird as well. It does pretty good for cows in front of you, and even ones that are a little above you, but forget ones that are below you. This is especially true for the Black Angus ones when they appear on the bottom row. If you're at the top lane when this happens, yeah, you aren't getting that one and losing a bit of your cattle buffer in the process. I did kind of discover a strategy that did help me secure the patch though, which was basically waiting until the slowest cattle appeared on the top and bottom rows respectively, and keeping them there while focusing on the middle rows, as new ones won't spawn in when a row is already occupied. The point requirement for this one is 3,000, which isn't too bad, especially when you consider the Black Angus by themselves are a few hundred points, about 10% of your goal. Again, it just largely depends on that pesky RNG and if you can manage it. Still a pretty fun game though. Number 47, Star Master. When I think about Star Master, I compared it to the methodology of Robot Tank with the slight complexity of Space Shuttle. Don't worry though, this is still about 1/20th as complex as the Space Shuttle game. It just requires some of the extra switches of the Atari console to work properly. I swear, some of these old games were very, very ambitious. Anyway, this game has you trying to hunt down and eliminate enemies in a giant space field. This field has a number of different sectors that you have to travel through warp gates to get to, and in addition to dodging meteors and enemy fire, you also have to manage your fuel properly so you don't get stranded in the deep recesses of space. You can gain more fuel by visiting space stations and docking with them to replenish your energy, so in between your extermination duties, be sure to visit a station to rest and recharge when needed. Your objective is to eliminate every enemy unit, and thankfully you have a map that shows where they all are and how many are left, so just keep moving until you get them all. Now, as far as the patches for this game are concerned, and yes, there are multiple, you have 4 patches to collect, and each patch basically requires you to get an optimal or pretty close to optimal score for each difficulty level. There are 4 difficulties, each one with a different number of enemies and enemy speed values, and you can bet the later difficulties can last so much longer than the former ones. Also, you get point penalties whenever you take damage, whenever you have to dock to replenish your fuel, or by just taking extra time. So you have to be fast, efficient, and careful in order to get these scores. However, I honestly don't think they're that hard to get. It took 2 attempts to get the first patch, and even then, my first attempt was still pretty close, and the second patch was pretty much a double attempt as well, and to be fair, I was still trying to figure out some of the mechanics by this point too. I only opted to get 2 of the 4 patches though, as that pretty much got the point across of this game. Overall, it was a pretty cool game, although it was another game with very bad flashing, so I don't recommend extended viewing of this game if you have very sensitive eyes. Just saying. Number 48, Tennis. I'm honestly surprised there are so few sports games in this collection, but yeah, it's the game of tennis. A very simplified version of tennis, but hey, it actually controlled pretty decently, so I was impressed with it at least. Although, mastering this one did take some effort. You really have to learn the placements for making really tight shots, because if you don't, the rallies will go on forever. Heck, I had a rally that seriously felt like it went on for 200 plus shots at one point. Anyway, there is a patch for this one, and all you have to do is beat the CPU. Scoring works just like tennis, and for the number of games you have to win, you need to win 6 while also being at least 2 games in front of your opponent. Quite the endurance round for sure. But hey, here's the good news. This is actually the last patch for Activision Anthology, so surely this will be over very soon, right? Well, about that, just stay tuned. Number 49, Thwalker. This game was interesting. You're basically a little music guy and you bounce around a music room collecting musical notes in order to create a small little tune. Incorrect notes will bounce you around, and if you collide with any instruments, you will lose a life. Once you get all the requested notes, you then have to climb the stage again and grab the treble clef to play your tune and essentially finish the stage. You can also collect any instruments at this point to add to your little musical number, which is kinda neat, although kinda pointless in retrospect. Honestly, it's a fun, quirky little game. It's got 16 stages to play, each with different intensities of obstacles, but at the core, it just plays the same song every single time, so it gets very, very repetitive. It was apparently just a homebrew or prototype game though, so that's why there wasn't a patch for it. Kinda glad there wasn't though, because even though it wasn't too terrible to beat or play, it did feel kind of awkward moving around and controlling your character, not gonna lie. Number 50, Title Match Pro Wrestling. Remember boxing from much earlier in this collection? Well, despite this game looking more detailed and interesting, boxing was still somehow the more fun game to play, because this game felt terrible to play. It's essentially a wrestling game, so you have to weaken your opponent and then pin them down to win the match. But I swear, I just could not get a good feel for the pin down inputs. You have to grab your opponent and then quickly do a quick series of other inputs to get them down, and most of these inputs were pressing the A button and a directional input at the same time, and it just felt really, really awkward. Not to mention, the CPU just always succeeded at these maneuvers without even trying. The folly of dealing with AI that knows how to perfectly react at all times. I eventually did figure out how to win a tag match of this, which I considered my completion requirement, but once again, there was no patch for this game, so definitely a game you don't have to mess around with if you don't want to. And honestly, I never really want to mess around with this game ever again. Number 51, Tomcat. Oh man, after Space Shuttle, I was really hoping that there weren't any more complex games left in this collection. And then I played Tomcat. Now, I'll quickly state that this game was not as complicated as Space Shuttle was. However, finding a guide for this online was impossible. All I found to help me were just some random comments on retro achievements for this one, and while they were helpful, getting everything together correctly in one run was still quite the endeavor. Basically, in this game, you simulate controlling an F-14 Tomcat fighter plane. You have to successfully control the taking off portion, ascending to a manageable height, initiating in combat with other fighter planes, and then successfully landing your aircraft for the next phase before you run out of fuel. Taking off wasn't too bad, and the process is explained well enough in the manual, but the combat phase was rough. You essentially have to lock onto your opposition and fire at them before they get too close, or worse, behind you, because if you don't manage to do this, they will seriously evade you like the plague, and it's really hard and awkward to get them in front of you again once they do get past you. You can try slowing down, but even then, there were times that they still managed to evade me for some reason, and it's almost like they were right on top of me, mirroring every movement of mine that I did. It was really frustrating, not gonna lie. Not to mention, you have to constantly switch between different menus while playing this, as combat and general plane movement are controlled in two different menus, which just made it even more awkward for me to manage, as I'm someone who already takes a bit longer to react and make my moves, and in this game, you don't really have that luxury. I actually ended up practicing each of these phases on a different emulator using save states, and eventually I did make it into the landing phase. The landing phase is also really complicated. You have to meet a certain number of conditions before you can even see the runway, and it's hard to figure out what those conditions are because the game's sound effects will start blaring at you, and it's hard to know or tell if you're doing something right or wrong. I did eventually get a landing though, and it did give me a current ranking score, which I will consider my completion for this one, since there is no patch anyway. I tried this again without save states, and although I did eventually make it to the landing phase again, I apparently did something wrong, as the runway didn't even appear, and I followed the instructions exactly, so I have no idea what was up with that. I ultimately decided to just declare that my save state file was good enough, because we had seen each aspect of the game at that point, and again, it's not like they gave you a patch for this anyway. Also, apparently there's more to this game, because after landing from the day phase, you can then do a mission at night, which seems to be just the same thing again, but just with night visuals instead. I didn't think it was important to showcase this though, so I left it at that and moved on. After completing various phases of this game, you get a rank based on the number of successful landings completed, the number of planes you shot down, as well as your accuracy with your aerial dogfights. Since I only made one landing, it only gave me a rank of 1, the lowest without being 0. But hey, that's enough to get on the board, and that's all I'm really concerned with. Kudos if you can do better though, but I just was not vibing with this game, and was really hoping that would be it for the simulations, because they seriously got very overwhelming for me in this game. Number 52, Vault Assault. This was probably one of the most simplistic Atari games of the entire bunch. Maybe not as much as Human Bloody Freeway, but still, it was pretty close to that. Honestly, the best way I can describe this is whack-a-mole. When an enemy appears, press the correct directional input and the fire button, and react fast so you can try to get as many points and hits as possible. There's apparently 9 levels of intensity for this game, which I managed to get on my first attempt, and since there was no patch for this game, I pretty much considered this completed after that. Something nice, short and sweet, after some of the other games we've had to deal with. And honestly, I am very much fine with that. Number 53, Venetian Blinds. I can't really explain this game in words, so I'll let the gameplay speak for itself. Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's a window blind simulator. That was quick, easy, and painless. Real talk though, there is actually some deep lore for this game, or rather its development. Apparently this happened during a lawsuit between Atari and Activision that was going on at this point, and this got developed by Activision as a tongue-in-cheek joke of sorts. Apparently Atari had what was known as the Venetian blind technique, basically a simulation of slightly improved graphical effects that went beyond the capabilities of the Atari 2600's original hardware. So, Activision decided to demo this game, and while doing so, they asked the all-important question of, is this what they meant by the Venetian blind technique? Pretty funny stuff, I must say. But yeah, as expected, no patch here, and no real reason to play this game any further. Moving on. Number 54, Video Euchre. For those who like Euchre, well, now you can play Euchre. Honestly, it's a pretty nice simulation of the game, all things considered, and it actually seems to at least work, unlike what Bridge did earlier in this collection. It did take me a few rounds to be victorious over the CPU, though. I had played Euchre before this, but it had been a while and I had to remember all the little intricacies of how to play. Although, I swear, it did seem like the CPU opponents were cheating, though. They always seemed to get really good hands, and it always felt like they knew what exactly we had as well, in addition to what we were going to play, which made it feel really unfair at certain points. Eventually, though, me and my partner hit a good streak, and we had an amazing comeback to tie a game 9-9 after being down 4-9 before that. Then it was just a matter of taking one more game, which we managed to do, and take the victory. Another one down, with only 2 more prototypes to go. Number 55, Unknown Prototype Number 1. Okay, so apparently Activision Anthology has 56 games, not 55 like the box art claims, but the last 2 games aren't really games, just prototypes that never officially released. Well, surely this means these are only concepts, and therefore there must not be a lot to do or showcase here, right? Well, okay, that should be the case, but due to my stubbornness, especially when it comes to puzzle games, I decided to try and complete Unknown Prototype 1, and that was probably a mistake. Try to think of this as a Rubik's Cube, meaning a slide puzzle. You essentially need to move all the squares to their correct position, basically a colored gradient layout from red to purple, which is easier said than done, since it's not just a matter of picking one piece and swapping it with another one. No, you have to actually move all these pieces around one by one. Every time you move forward in one direction, you push all the squares in front of you forward, while the square at the end moves behind you. And using those rules, you have to solve the puzzle in that fashion. Like a Rubik's Cube, you have to figure out the best way to move pieces around without really affecting certain parts of the game board in the process. And if you do, you need to do it in a way where you can easily put stuff back after making your alterations. I actually was figuring out stuff pretty quickly, and managed to get a good amount of the board completed during my first session. However, once I got to my last 2 rows, I realized that my process wasn't going to work anymore, because the squares just weren't lining up properly. And any one mistake or misdirection can seriously destroy your entire board if you aren't careful. I actually ended up going to BreadGhost's channel, the other GBA challenger I mentioned earlier in this video, to look at his process for this game, and figured out a basic layout I could work with. Basically, you had to solve every column up to row 5, with exception to the middle column. Then you have to align that middle column in a certain way, since that will ultimately be your finishing position. Then you solve the bottom row up until column 6, and then you use those corner 4 squares in the bottom right as your buffer zone to solve the rest of the puzzle. Lining up row 6 in the same way, you align column 5, so your final movements will basically solve the rest of the puzzle. I was really nervous while I was doing this process, and even opted to make save states throughout this just so I wouldn't undo any of my progress. I had a method in place, so I was clearly capable of solving this again, but just in case I didn't solve it by the end of the stream, I wanted at least something to come back to so I wouldn't have to start everything over again. Everything was looking great so far though, until I reached my final stretch of movements and realized that my last 2 squares on row 7 were somehow mixed up. I was literally 2 squares off the correct solution, and that was demoralizing. Using my process though, I did a small bit of backtracking to undo my solution, making sure not to mess anything else up, and tried some slight alterations until they were better positioned, and sure enough, after doing this, I had a scenario where they did line up properly, and I completed the puzzle. Thank the Lord. Ah, finally! Ah. Woo! That was a rough one, spending nearly 6 hours on this one puzzle game, and I am not joking when I say that. Also, thanks again to BreadGhost for this victory, not just for his video instructions, but for also walking me through the final steps of this during my stream. Getting row 6 together was easily the most confusing part of this for me, because I just wasn't seeing how the 4 square buffer solution worked, but once he gave me a step-by-step instruction, I grasped it pretty easily. Despite the length of this, I honestly kinda liked this puzzle challenge. It was hard and stressful, but definitely felt the most rewarding to complete, at least in my eyes anyway. Not bad for an unknown prototype. Number 56, Unknown Prototype Number 2. This prototype was much less interesting and fun, but thankfully it was also pretty quick. The idea for this one is that you're trying to stack blocks to make a ladder for your character to climb. However, this being a prototype shows its identity well, because this game is buggy. Buggy as hell. I actually had to switch difficulties on the right difficulty switch to even get a version of this game that worked, since the B game just didn't let my character climb for some reason. Also, you have to complete this task fast, otherwise you just kinda die, apparently. There are only 4 levels of this until the game just loops back to level 1, so I just made my completion getting through the 4 levels and being done with it after that. There's no patch for this, and it just seems like a high score game, so nothing is really lost by stopping and not playing more of this. Well guys, we did it. We made it through Activision Anthology. And yes, I'm aware of the video time, trust me, I'm the one who wrote all 70 pages of this video script. I'm aware this was a long one, but keep in mind, I played this game for nearly 50 hours. This was double the amount of time of Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories, and that was the longest game before this. And like, what do you expect with a compilation game that has 56 different games involved? Given they are very simple games, and you could argue that I didn't need to spend so much time with some of them, but still, it's a lot of content to look through, and I'm convinced I still only scratched the surface of some of them, at least with this summary. Overall, despite the amount of time this took, I was actually really satisfied with this game and this compilation. I didn't even grow up with Atari either. My first system was the Super Nintendo, so even these games seemed outdated for me at the time. But at the core, this was a nice dedication to Atari's Activision lineup, and a good majority of the games here were actually pretty solid, or at least had some good development behind them. From my recollection, I'd only say 10% of this collection was truly bad, and even then, some of that 10% was just underwhelming or unfinished in some cases. So yeah, ultimately there was a lot of good quality here, and a nice quantity as well, especially for a Game Boy Advance title. As you might expect, the console versions of this game have even more games, but still, just the fact that it had this much content is still quite the impressive feat. Also, the inclusion of the patch system I think gives a lot of these games, which would seem like quick one-and-done exercises otherwise, more replayability and something to aim for. I wouldn't recommend going for all of them, obviously, but still, it's nice to give gamers some kind of objective, and I think the patches work well for that, especially for games that they might be enjoying and want to do more with. Overall, some of my favorite games of this collection were Cosmic Commuter, Enduro, Oink, Robot Tank, Stampede, Star Master, and, believe it or not, the Unknown Prototype puzzle game. My all-time favorite ended up being Pressure Cooker, though, and the close runner-ups being Frostbite, Hero, and Pitfall II. My least favorite games, though, were River Raid 2, Space Shuttle, Tomcat, and the second Unknown Prototype game, with my ultimate least favorite probably being Title Match Pro Wrestling. This game was just ass to control, and I did not feel rewarded in the least bit while playing it or completing this one. Even though I spent forever on games like Dragster and Dolphin, at least they felt somewhat rewarding to complete, and although I didn't really care for the flight simulation games, at least I can respect the amount of authenticity that went into their design in order to make them rather faithful simulations, even though it was definitely not necessary in the least bit to go for that. For enjoyability, I actually give Activision Anthology a 4 out of 5. It was a great collection, and I had a lot of fun with this one. It wasn't perfect by any means, and I do think some of the games could have opted to have different control designs mapped for them. After all, we're not using an Atari joystick anymore, come on, but a vast majority of the game is still very much playable and fun, and I give a lot of kudos for that. For difficulty, this was a hard one to lock down, so I ultimately just met in the middle with a 3 out of 5. If you are just going for a quick play of all the games with no real objectives in mind, it's a 1. But if you want to go for all the patches and full completion, that's 5 out of 5 territory right there, because some of these challenges are rough. Hell, I'm convinced Kaboom's patch is practically impossible with natural human ability. Bread Ghost may have proved that statement wrong, but still, I wasn't about to subject myself to that meat grinder. Kudos to him for doing that, though. But even he didn't do the Space Shuttle patches either, and I personally don't blame him for that. Those seem to be really, really rough. So yeah, that's Activision Anthology. It was a long road and playthrough, but I'm proud of making it to the end. We'll definitely have other retro compilations like this in the future, but as far as my understanding, this one is easily the most extensive one, so any others should in theory be a lot shorter, and I'm personally very thankful for that. However, it was nice to be overtaken by this game, and in my mind, I'm happy we were able to see what this game was all about and all that it had to offer. And without further ado, let's take a look at the next game we'll be playing for this challenge. Okay guys, thank you for watching this summary. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to leave a comment and or like on the video, as those will really help me in these videos out. And stay tuned for future summaries of this series. If you also want to watch full playthroughs of these games for this challenge, check out the video description for a full playlist of everything that's been uploaded and exported so far. And if you're curious about what I'm playing right now for the challenge, be sure to stop by my Twitch channel to see what my current progress is. Just be warned, I'll be a lot further ahead of where we are for these summaries, so keep that in mind. This has been SlimKirby in the GBA series, and I'll talk to you fine people next time. Later, folks.